Hello, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. We are live this Monday. Alexander, how are you doing in London?
Very well. We've had storms and rains here and flooding, but all is well with me, and I'm pleased to be back.
Okay, great. How's everyone doing wherever you are in the world on this Monday, 26th of July? July is almost over. As we head into August, let's do a quick tour of where people are joining us from as we wait for some more people to join us. I didn't give much of a notice before we went live. I just got really, really busy today, so I didn't have much time to prepare for things. But let's see, we have got Ultra Marcus in South Wales. How are you doing, Ultra Marcus? Article in Zero Hedge about the you know what we know and the tests. Very interesting article from Zero Hedge. I agree. Wisconsin, USA, Denmark. Where else? Sunny Wales. Hello from Hungary. Hungary. The war against Orban. The never-ending war against Orban.
He's made some very interesting moves, by the way, which you might want to talk about, because
tell us. I actually had an email from someone in Hungary. I did a small show on that, and someone emailed me with some of the moves he's made, and interesting moves. Referendum.
Absolutely, that's what I was thinking about. So we'll see how that turns out and how it goes. But it's interesting ground he's chosen to fight, and of course it's not arguably he didn't choose the ground. The EU did. But he's decided to make a stand on it, and we'll see how it turns out. But Hungary is a very interesting country, and Orban is a very interesting leader, and we'll see how it works out for him.
Okay. South Staffordshire, Queensland, greetings. Essex, UK, Ireland, North London. Let's see. Hello from a Portuguese in Brasilia, Brazil. Hello to you. And hello to everyone in India and Galispera and Nikos. Hope you're doing well. Atlanta, Georgia, good to have you here. Everyone in Georgia and in Manchester and in Newcastle and in Jordan and in China and in Sydney and in Bali and Bahrain and Massachusetts, USA, Sarajevo, Oxfordshire, Iowa, Alexander, Canberra. Let's do an around the world in news. Two big stories. Let's talk about a coup in Tunisia.
Well, Tunisia is in some ways a small country. It's not central to the Arab world. It's central to Africa. Of course, what goes on in Tunisia is extremely important and very interesting for people in Tunisia, and one must never discount or overlook that. But to me, it does actually have, beyond for what it's done for Tunisians, a very great symbolic significance. And I'll tell you what it is. Was if you go back to 2011, that was where the Arab Spring began. It actually began with protests in Tunisia, which led to the then president having, fleeing the country and going to Saudi Arabia. And Tunisia was for a very, very long time held up by the Western media as the poster boy for the Arab Spring, the country which managed to make the transition to democracy, where civil institutions had been established, where a moderate Muslim Brotherhood government had become installed, and which was supposedly the example for all other Arab states to follow. And what we've just seen with this coup is that has all come crashing down to earth. In fact, there's been no fundamental change of the situation in Tunisia. It remains a deeply divided country. It remains a very poor country in some ways, not perhaps by Arab standards, but certainly by Western standards. It remains a poor country. It remains riven by religious differences. The Muslim Brotherhood government has not been vastly popular. And now we see the president bringing out the army, illegally dissolving parliament, sacking the prime minister, essentially saying that he's going to run things by decree. So we see the reversion to type. And most interestingly, some reports suggest that what the president has done is actually popular. And apparently there have been protests against the government for some time, and people have been out in the streets, and there's been honking and celebrations in the streets of Tunis. I'm sure not everybody is celebrating, and maybe there will be more problems coming again. But the Great Arab Spring, hailed by the likes of Barack Obama as, the promise of a new dawn in the Middle East, its success story, its success story, has just gone down in flames.
All right, let's talk about weekend protests. Australia, UK, France, Italy, all over the place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All over the place. So you're in London, big protests in London.
Oh, absolutely.
If a news media outlet tells me those were not big protests, I don't know what they're talking about. I believe it was Trafalgar Square.
Yeah.
I mean, it was jam-packed with people.
Yeah.
Pretty controversial, too, with some of the speakers and some stuff around. What do you make of all the protests? Yeah, go ahead.
And I should say, I mean, some of the speakers went too far. I mean, far too far. And some of the things
that's what I'm saying, controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but having said that, it's perhaps important to say that most of the speakers who were there were in no sense professional politicians or people who have, learned the language of politics. So, they speak, passionately, and perhaps they go too far. But perhaps one shouldn't take that entirely seriously in the way some parts of the media are doing. And I want to mention the media because, of course, other than highlighting some of the words used by some of these politicians some of these people who spoke at that rally in Trafalgar Square, they basically ignored the rally entirely. You won't find much coverage of it in the British media. But of course, it is now consistent. It is the pattern in much of the world. And it's important to say that apparently the protests in Cuba and Haiti, which we covered, were partly also part of this wave of protests that we are now seeing. And of course, it comes down to two things. Firstly, there is the stress of lockdowns, of the various restrictions that people have had to endure, the sense that those restrictions are intensifying and escalating, that more things are going to be done with passports and QR codes and such like things. So there is that. And then, of course, there is the growing economic stress, which is also affecting people. Two, of course, are very closely connected, but we're starting to see the effects of inflation. And those are certainly starting to have an effect, in my opinion, already in European countries. And of course, in countries of the global south, that's much greater. We're going to get an awful lot more of this sort of thing over the next few months. Of that, I am sure.
Can you get into inflation a little bit? Because that's a big story that no one's talking about. Things are starting to unravel with a lot of economies and the economic outlook. Biden's poll numbers, by the way, are dropping like a rock. If you are to believe the initial poll numbers that had him at like 56%, if you are to believe those poll numbers, he's dipping now under 50 and dropping fast.
I didn't believe those poll numbers, but I do believe the trend. So I don't believe those poll numbers were an accurate reflection of how popular he actually was. Remember, whatever you think of the election outcome last year, it bore no relation anyway to some of those opinion poll figures that were being circulated during the election. Do you remember there was one which put Biden, was it 15% ahead or 20% ahead? And we did a video about it in which we said this isn't true. And we actually unpacked it. So I don't believe those poll numbers, but I do believe the trend. And of course, the inflation is real. And it's greater than some people are saying. Officially in the United States, it's now running at an annualized rate of 5.4%. I know many people, including people who are in business, in industry, in economics, who think it's probably double that in reality in terms of consumer price inflation. We're seeing inflation now affecting the building industry. We're seeing inflation affecting food and groceries. And we're going to start before very long. And this, I predict, is going to be a major issue for many people. Inflation starting to affect energy prices and fuel prices. And that's, of course, eating into household budgets. And why do we have inflation? Well, the reason we have inflation is because the US government, the new administration, after it came into office, they took over what was, in fact, a growing and recovering economy. And in my opinion, partly because they are prisoners of very peculiar and untested and almost certainly wrong economic theories, and also because they need to spend lots of money to reconcile all the various different factions that make up the Democratic Party. They went on a spending splurge that we have never seen in US history. There's never been anything like it before. Economists and commentators have pointed out that this far exceeds Lyndon Johnson's great spending splurge of the 1960s. I believe it actually even exceeds Roosevelt's spending splurge during the New Deal. You have to go to wartime situations to find a government spending money on this scale. It's unique in peacetime. It's been copied internationally around the world, especially in Europe and in other countries that are aligned with the West. And this massive wave of money that's been pouring out of the central banks and the finance ministries and the treasury departments and the banks themselves, the private banks, which now are also recklessly, very often lending. This vast wave of private money has to find some outlet, and it is doing so in the form of higher prices. And that is causing disruptions in supply chains. It's creating shortages in supply chains as companies from one day to the next aren't sure quite how much, how much they have to spend to buy the subcomponents they need. And those problems in supply chains are adding another twist to the inflation spiral. One central bank, the Russian central bank, has responded by raising interest rates, but all the other central banks so far are standing firm and are continuing to pump money out. The US QE is running at the moment around $120 billion a month. And one wonders for how much longer this will go on for. And incidentally, another feature of a spending splurge like this and of spending money in this kind of way is that we are now starting to see a decline in the rate of recovery. And anybody who is familiar with inflation crises, and I lived through the stagflation period of the 1970s, knows that that is an entirely normal consequence and a normal product of an uncontrolled rise in prices. So that's affecting household budgets around the world. In North America and Europe, that's already putting a lot of people in distress. In the global south, it is catastrophic. If you live in Egypt or Tunisia, then the very last thing you need is to have an inflation spiral underway. It pushes you to the margins of existence. And that's one reason why we're seeing the protests.
Yeah, they're printing money everywhere, Alexander, all over the place. Someone in the live stream said that they're printing money like crazy in South Korea. So,
Japan,
Japan too. I mean, they don't know this. All the leaders in all the countries around the world, they don't understand what's going on.
No,
I mean, are they trying to just crash everything on purpose? I mean, really, because if we head into another lockdown scenario, which is likely, I'm not saying it's going to happen. It's likely. Come fall, it's game over.
Well, can I just say, if they are doing this on purpose, then they are fools. I can't emphasize this too strongly. I mean, actually crashing your own economy is the silliest thing anybody can do. People who do that are blind and stupid. And if they want to create a revolution, well, they're going about it the right way, but they will be its first victims. It's always that way. So it's an idiotic thing to do. And I would add, by the way, we talked about the West and central banks in the West doing this. China, to a certain extent, has also been doing it too. Not on the same scale, but credit emission in China has also been very high. Though, again, I understand the authorities are trying to do something about it, but maybe rather belatedly. But if your general policy is to try to wreck your economies by setting in trade an inflation crisis and a production crisis, which, as I said, the two are connected. Throw on top of that all of these restrictions and controls, then, as I said, some people have taken leave of their senses. That's all I can say about it. So if it's a plot, if it's a plan, then the people who are plotting and are planning to do these things are mad. Perhaps they are, though, because some of the things they say might make one think so.
Yeah, maybe this is the drive towards justifying a central bank digital currency or something along those lines. I don't know. I'm spitballing stuff right now, but it sounds crazy to me that all these quote unquote smart people sitting at the various central banks and at the Fed don't know this or don't understand this. But something is amiss, and all the bad stuff, all the preparation of bad things always happens in the dog days of summer. That's one thing that I've noticed. And then when you roll into when you roll into like September, October, all hell kind of breaks loose. That's always been the trend with news. Real quick, Alexander, before you answer that, this is not going to be a call-in show, guys. Just no time to prepare for it today, but we'll get to the call-in shows on another live stream. So just send us your questions in the live stream. I'll also jump into the super chats and see what questions you have as far as news topics that you want us to discuss. Alexander, what do you think of what I just said?
I think you're absolutely spot on. By the way, your point you made about summer, not only are you right about that, it is a well-known fact amongst historians. Both world wars, both the First and Second World Wars, for example, started in the dog days of summer in July and August. That's when everybody's on holiday, all the important people are away from their desks and aren't really thinking about things very much, when all the sort of middle-ranking people are sort of running things and running amok, and when things spiral out of control. That was what happened in 1914. 1939 was rather different, but not entirely different. So summer is the most dangerous period. And everybody will tell you that August is the most dangerous month. So there we go. So time for economic crisis. I mean, bear in mind, if you're thinking about, you go all the way back to 1929 with the Wall Street crash. We always think of the Wall Street crash as an event which took place in October 1929. But in fact, the markets began to sag in August. That was when the real problems started to accumulate. And if we go forward now to 2008, it's the same pattern, exactly the same pattern. It was in the summer of 2007 that we've got, firstly, what people used to call the credit crunch, forgotten words, but that was when one of the big French banks confirmed that it was in trouble. And then there was some problems that began to manifest themselves in the autumn. And then it all seemed to hold together for the rest of 2007 and early 2008. And then we went into the summer. It became increasingly clear that things were not working out. And so summer is a very, very dangerous time. Very dangerous time in economics. Very, very dangerous time in terms of geopolitics and wars.
Yeah. Alan wants to know what's going to happen when the U.S. leaves the Middle East.
And news on that front too, because I've done some programs on my channel saying, that I suspect, and I think this is probably likely, that the US is gradually, perhaps without even really understanding what it's doing or thinking it through or even agreeing to itself that is what it's doing, that the US is taking the first steps towards quitting both Iraq and Syria. This is controversial. A lot of people on the threads of my programs didn't agree, and I understand why, and I can see why people might not agree. But now we've had a meemeeting between the president, the POTUS, and the Prime Minister of Iraq, and apparently there's been discussions about pulling out US troops, or at least combat troops from Iraq. In reality, the troops that are actually there are intended to stay there on a training mission, which everybody knows that doesn't really mean anything. But we've had other parties in Iraq now insisting that all US troops must leave, and the pressure on the Iraqi prime minister is enormous. And we don't really see very much pushback to all of that from the administration. So it is highly possible that the US will eventually leave Iraq. And it may, if it leaves Iraq, it will have to leave Syria, because the two operations are logistically connected. So when we're talking about the Middle East, it's important always to make a distinction. There is the northwestern Middle East, Iraq, Syria, those places where the United States is pulling out. And then there is the Gulf, where the United States has 40,000 troops in Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and other places. Those will probably stay. But it is looking increasingly likely that it's going to pull its troops out of Iraq and Syria. That will be good for Syria, perhaps very bad for Iraq. And it's quite possible, quite likely, that there will be a void created, a political vacuum, and we will see the various surrounding countries, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, there's Egypt, the regional states, and then the great powers beyond it, Russia and China, all maneuvering with each other to try to fill the vacuum that the United States has left. In which case, we could see, at least in the short term, a renewal of violence. But can I say, ultimately, I think a US withdrawal from the Middle East probably is going to be a good thing for the United States and for the Middle East, because the Middle Eastern countries will then be obliged to sort out their own problems.
Okay. Sheamus says consumer prices are rising in China. I'm living here and I see it. Boxes made smaller. They must be subsidizing basics. And James wants to know if Switzerland is moving away from neutrality.
Well, that's the first point is absolutely spot on. It's completely right. As I said, the Chinese have also been spent very, very recklessly last year, and spent very recklessly at the beginning of this year. And by the way, the Chinese economy is also slowing. I mean, so both the two big economies, the US and China, are both slowing. A fact which is not going according to plan. It's not what either the current administration or the government in Beijing, I think, were anticipating. So they both expected at the start of the year that they'd both be going forward, or full throttle, and instead things are slowing down. Now, so that's a very, very good point. I don't think Switzerland has ever been completely neutral, if I have to be absolutely straightforward about this. I think Switzerland has always been, broadly speaking, aligned with the West at every point in time since certainly the end of the Second World War. They've managed it with a great deal of skill. They've avoided getting involved in too many issues with too many countries. And I think on balance, they'll probably be able to maintain that sort of high wire act, because they're very skilled at it. But I think that the idea of Swiss neutrality, though it's an attractive one, and it has some relevance. I mean, the Swiss Red Cross, for example, does use neutrality to do many things, and many good things. I don't think we should take it too seriously altogether.
Okay, let's get some more questions here. Some super chats from Raphael says, one thing I want to start with, Jovenel Moises's death is completely similar with the way Samuel Doy died. What do you guys think? I am right.
You are right. You're absolutely right. But can I just say the Moisey business is getting ever odder. I mean, now we have one person. We have this Florida. I don't know whether he's a doctor or a pastor who's supposed to have ordered his killing.
It was a doctor.
It was a doctor. I think he was a doctor. Then now we're getting a person who's supposed to be a middle-ranking official in the Interior Ministry. No part of this story makes any sort of sense. And what one hears, it's not very easy to get news
That's
out.
one part that makes sense. The fact that they were trained by the CIA, some of the guys, that makes sense. Go ahead.
You took the very words out of my mouth. I mean, really. I mean, I would love to know what is going on. It's a sign of how effectively news about Haiti has been controlled for so long that we have all of these clues, all the pieces of the jigsaw there, I suspect, are there. If somebody really understands this picture, they could put all the pieces together from what we already know and come up with an answer about what has happened. I don't know the overall image of the jigsaw. I don't know how all the pieces fit into place, but certainly this is a bizarre and remarkable affair. And I think, Raphael, your point is absolutely spot on.
All right. Raphael also wants to know, Taiwan will be the Waterloo of the USA. China and Russia are teaming up to make sure this will be their coming out party.
Indeed, somebody said, actually, I'm not sure who it was, that Taiwan, it was The Economist, not a good source place. They said that Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world. And by the way, and I agree, and I've just done a program for my channel about, an absolutely repeat performance of the Anchorage Summit that took place in Alaska between China and the US. The same thing's happening all over again in Tianjin in China today. And we're getting more reports about the kind of things that are happening. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the Chinese and the Americans are just going for each other without, any pretense anymore. I mean, they're almost, they're basically shouting at each other. And Taiwan is the absolute center of it. And the US, in my opinion, I've got to say this, I know a lot of people don't like this. I think the US has maneuvered itself into an impossible position with Taiwan because it's given a guarantee effect, essentially, to defend Taiwan from China. And it's not a guarantee it can realistically hope to fulfill unless it's prepared to use nuclear weapons, which I don't think anybody seriously believes that it is. It's like, again, what the US has done with the Baltic states. It's given the Baltic states a guarantee by bringing them into NATO, even though it knows perfectly well it can't defend them. I don't think there's any Russian threat to the Baltic states. There certainly is a Chinese drive, an absolutely fundamental will on the part of China one day to take possession of Taiwan. And I think the US has miscalculated on this badly. I think they were going to draw a red line with China. They should have been much more careful when they drew it, rather than give that kind of guarantee over Taiwan. And that was a mistake. And I think the US might live with it. By the way, there was an article by a commentator in The Guardian, Simon Tisdall, a person I absolutely detest, but he made that very point. He said that a massive smash up between China and the US is coming, and the US hasn't really thought it through.
What does that mean, a smash up?
If you read his article, I think he sees some kind of military. That's exactly what he means. Yeah.
That's not good. All right, Alexander Rishi Sunak, Britcoin. The Britcoin is what he's talking about. Digital currency in Britain. What do you think of that? Is that going to help the economy of the UK? The Britcoin.
No, is a simple answer. I mean, Alex, you made some points about, the caliber of our leaders right at the start of the program and some of the fantastic schemes that they have. Well, this is an example. I mean, it's just again, a finance minister, a fully paid up member of the globalist elite, by the way. It's always important to remember this about Sunak. He went to Winchester School, one of the great public schools of England. He's born to enormous wealth, married into even greater wealth. He's somebody who is absolutely at home in places like Davos and all the rest. In fact, not only is he at home there, but, they greet him there as one of their own, because that is what he is. And he's coming up with these kind of ideas. So, if you think about, an attempt to crash the world economy in order to launch digital currencies, well, Sunak could very well be part of that. But if it is part of that, then it just goes to show how utterly juvenile, adolescent, and detached from reality and from the lives of the people these leaders are supposed to lead, how detached that is.
Yeah, Britcoin.
Britcoin.
All right. Darth OP says, what would a hat trick of a Le Pen win, Swedish Democrat win, and a Salvini-Meloni combo mean for Europe, EU, and the world?
Well, first of all, can I just say that would be a tremendous event. And I, for one, were that to happen, would take out my champagne. I mean, I really would, because unsustainable situation. I mean, I want to stress, I mean, I'm not.
It's not impossible.
It's not impossible.
It could happen.
It's not impossible. I mean, and I don't want to give the impression that I consider these leaders to be flawless, virtuous people, but they do embody resistance and opposition to a model that we are all that's been inflicted on us, which is both unsustainable and unbelievably damaging, and which has to end. So if that were to happen, firstly, it would be 2016 again on steroids. 2016 being Trump winning in the US and Brexit happening in Britain. It'd be 2016 on steroids. It would mean, I think, I mean, if that were to happen, it's very difficult to see how the European Union could continue. I mean, it would probably begin to unravel, given that they're now already quarreling with other member states like Poland and Hungary, which I no doubt we will come to. So it would mean the end of the European Union as we've known it. And that would in turn mean the end of the globalization experiment. I mean, I think that's a given, because globalization basically is centered on the EU. In a way, it forms the model, because you have a parastate bodies that run everything, a single market structure which is regulated by all kinds of rules that are created by these not democratically elected parastatal bodies, and open borders. I mean, that's globalization, if you like, in miniature. The EU has been, if you like, it's petri dish, as we discussed, I think, in a previous program. The World Economic Forum, the people who meet in Davos, originally called themselves the European Management Forum. They were set up in 1971, working to create this for the EU, and they wanted to, and they now basically want to extend it everywhere. So if it collapses at its center, at its ideological center, then I mean, the world will be a completely different place, a much better place, and I will certainly take out my champagne at that point.
From your Duran magic mug.
Oh, absolutely. The thing about this is that you can definitely drink champagne from Duran magic mugs. They're absolutely perfect for it. I've done it.
Davos, Switzerland, right?
Absolutely, Davos, Switzerland.
That answers your question about Switzerland.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. I mean, bear in mind, Klaus Schwab is a Swiss professor. I mean, I think he's of German nationality. A rather mysterious man. It's not very easy to get very much detail of his biography, but he is a Swiss professor at the end of the day. That's why he set it up. He set up the European Management Forum in Davos, because he got all of these people coming from across the EU to Switzerland for their skiing holidays, and it was sponsored by various Swiss institutions and Swiss banks, and they all get together at Davos and they talk how to remake first Europe and then the world.
Yeah. Reckless Abandon says something is brewing again between Russia and Ukraine. Putin's Russian People article taking Ukraine to the ECHR, clearing the decks before they solve the problem once and for all.
I think you may be right, actually. Now, can I just talk about these two events, because they're very interesting each individually. Now, the Ukraine article is this giant article that Putin wrote over a certain extended period of time, and certainly more people have written it, in which were involved in writing it, in which he basically says that Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia form a single cultural linguistic, ethnographic space, and were initially part of the same culture and country and civilization going all the way back to the Middle Ages. And that these parts of what you might call, if you like, the Russian world are not really separable, and that the attempts to force them to separate them has either been the product of experiments by revolutionaries in Russia, by the Bolsheviks in Russia, for their own ideological reasons, or of hostile countries like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Polish Commonwealth, the Ottomans, and that all of this works against the underlying unity of this region. And of course, the important point about that is that whether you agree with it or not, it says that Russia is not prepared to make any kind of concessions on the Donbass, because it regards the Donbass not just as foreign territory, but as part of the Russian world, and therefore something that Russia has an obligation to. But it also means that as far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine and Belarus are not mere foreign countries. They are part of this great indivisible whole of the Russian world. That's quite an extraordinary article, actually. Very interesting, very erudite, as much that Putin says is, and very interestingly timed, coming after the April crisis, when the Russians deployed all those troops to Ukraine's eastern border in response to Ukraine's deployment of troops along the contact line. So it does give the impression that Russia now feels that it is getting stronger and is preparing action with respect to Ukraine. And I think that this is where we come to the other point, which is the claim to the European Court of Human Rights about Ukraine. They've brought together all the various things that Ukraine has done, which violate human rights. By the way, I personally think they're entirely right on every point they're making in this complaint. But they must know that the European Court of Human Rights will not find in Russia's favor because of the nature of the political pressures on these courts today. So why are they doing it? And I think that they're setting out a red line. I think they're saying to the Europeans, we regard these things as violations of human rights. If your court doesn't agree with us, then we're going to reconsider our membership of that court and of the Council of Europe. And there's been much talk in Russia in recent years of withdrawing from the Council of Europe. So I think that's partly what that is, but it's also partly Russia saying to the West and to Ukraine that we regard these as massive violations of human rights and violations of human rights which affect us. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that these two moves taken together do point to a much more assertive Russia on Ukrainian issues from now on. And why has that happened? Multiple reasons. Nord Stream 2 being completed possibly is one, but I think it's also a sense that the Russians increasingly have that the geostrategic and military balance is shifting decisively in their favor now.
Rainy Steps Super Chat says, assassination attempted, President of Madagascar.
Oh, I haven't heard about this. Lots of this going. I haven't heard about this, but there's a lot of this going on now. So interesting story, interesting country.
A lot of assassination attempts,
yeah.
a lot of coups, a lot of stuff like this. Regime changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Seems like every week we're getting
absolutely
a different regime change, a different coup, a different assassination. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, lots of things are going on, and as I said, lots of pieces are moving. I mean, contrast this with the situation, say, in the 1990s. When everything was very, very quiet around the world, things were getting sorted out, or so it seemed. Obviously, things in Russia were very bad at that time. But overall, generally, everything was very placid on the surface. Well, it's not like that anymore. If I have to say what it reminds me of a little bit, it reminds me of the late 60s and early 70s, when there was a lot of activity going on. But this is on a bigger scale. And it's not entirely easy to get a sense of what is happening in the greater architecture. But I am sure that this all fits into an overall pattern.
Mark Hewitt wants to know, do you think that Bojo has the bottle to push the Article 16 button?
I wonder. Now, I think the thing to say about Bojo is that he has surprised us at various times. But I think before I proceed further, perhaps I should explain that this is all about that terrible Northern Ireland protocol, which is a legacy of Theresa May's agreement to the Irish backstop. So in order to get Theresa May's backstop out of the way and get a withdrawal agreement through the House of Commons, which eventually paved the way for an election, Johnson had to agree with the Europeans a deal which created trade barriers between Britain, what you might call mainland Britain, and Northern Ireland, keeping Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, within the European single market for many purposes. And this is unpopular in Northern Ireland, and it is causing growing problems there. There are now shortages in Northern Irish shops because it is not possible to import products easily from mainland Britain. I mean, bear in mind, Northern Ireland and Britain are part of the same country. They can't trade easily with each other. So the British have increasingly been insisting that this must be renegotiated, that it's unworkable, that this can't last. And the Europeans do what they always do. They say an absolute no. They're not prepared to renegotiate or change anything. Now, the big question is, will Johnson, faced with this situation, finally bite the bullet and decide unilaterally to invoke the instruments that exist in the withdrawal treaty to cancel this protocol unilaterally? I think he perhaps will. He's done that. He's shown that if pushed, he can do this thing before. I know lots of people who think he doesn't have this sort of courage, but I think on Europe and on European issues, I think Johnson understands that his entire political reputation is so bound up with this issue that he can't afford to pull back. But we shall see.
Well, what will Europe do? What will the EU do if he does pull the trigger?
Sanction Britain is the short answer. They'll impose all kinds of tariffs.
They're sanctioning their own member state in Hungary and Poland.
Absolutely,
so exactly.
Well,
seriously, that's a serious question.
It's a very serious question. It's an excellent question. I don't think sanctions by the EU on Britain will make any real difference. But the problem is not what the Europeans will do. It's what the people I will call the Remainers, who remain very powerful in Britain, in the Conservative Party, in the business community, in the civil service. It's more what they will do. And as I've discussed many times in many programs now on this channel, Johnson is visibly under an awful lot of pressure at the moment. There are clearly moves against him. The Sunak is now rising, or at least it's been built up in all sorts of ways. And one gets a good sense that there are people maneuvering to find ways to get Johnson out. So I think that's the thing. I think what Johnson is worried about. He's more worried about the situation in London than about what Brussels and Berlin and Frankfurt might do.
From Janet, 24.99 super chat. Thank you for Newsweek and Countdown. Thank you very much, Janet, for that. From Dan T, hope your program will talk about South China Sea. China's grab and stay strategy.
Absolutely.
In South China Sea has created a world's hotspot. Would China want to be seen as a respected leader or an outlawed bully?
Well, of course, the Chinese will argue it's the other way around. They will say the South China Sea is called the South China Sea because it borders upon China and it's their major trade route, and it's entirely proper and appropriate that they should have a kind of dominant influence there. But you are absolutely right. The Chinese have been asserting their position in the China Sea extremely aggressively. I mean, they've been building islands there. They've been pushing ships there. They've been sending fishing fleets to harass the Philippines and countries of that kind. They've been doing all these sort of things. And by the way, over the weekend, they also issued a threat that if British warships go anywhere close to these artificial islands within 12 kilometers of them, well, they will face a potential response from China. So the Chinese are taking these steps. Now, the question is, what does one do in the face of this? Does one push back against this? Does one actually counter by sending one's own naval ships into the South China Sea in an area where China does have military predominance? Or does one try to negotiate and do a deal? Now, at the moment, the entire push within the United States is to push back. I question, actually, whether that is sustainable. A lot of military people I know do. And we will see how this works out in the end. But are the Chinese asserting themselves? Are they bullying? Well, I suppose the answer is yes. Do they care? Obviously not.
Yeah. Open and listening, $5 super chat. Thank you very much. From Ryan, $4.99. Alexander, Alex, any conservative MP, conservative coalition call for Johnson's removal? Any examples of our leaning government fighting against the lockdown?
Not a single Conservative MP or minister has yet come out publicly to call for Johnson's removal. And I think at the moment, that will be a very difficult thing to do. I think he still has a lot of goodwill from the Conservative electorate because of the way he brought about Brexit and, you know, kept the Europeans at bay. And because, after all, he did win that election in December 2019, giving the Conservative Party a big majority, the biggest it's had since 1987. So I think that there is a lot of goodwill still to Johnson within the Conservative Party and within the Conservative electorate. And I think that it's going to be very difficult to remove him, though the pressure to do so undoubtedly is there. But at the moment, it is taking the form of intrigue. Now, the people who are plotting against Johnson, it's important to stress, are on the Conservative left. They are the left-wing Conservatives, the people who wanted to keep the Britain either in the EU or closer to the EU, who despise and dislike Johnson because they see him as outside the mainstream of establishment conservatism. They're a little bit like, if you like, the rhinos in the United States who worked against Donald Trump, the Mitch McConnell tendency, if you like, within the British Conservative Party. But if you are talking about critics of the lockdown policies, there are many of them also in the Conservative Party, including some MPs, and they are extremely outspoken. And the major Conservative newspaper, the only one that really matters in terms of its content, which is the Daily Telegraph, is very strongly opposed to lockdowns. If you go to it, you can read it. I mean, they sometimes use coded language, but they're very clear about that. However, those people tend to support Johnson because they don't want him to fall in a way that might let the left of the Conservative Party, the pro-European faction in the Conservative Party, take control. If you're talking about the Conservative Party being pro-Brexit and anti-lockdown, tends to go together.
Okay, Stan says, good news, Fauci is getting ratioed on YouTube. That is good news.
That is good news.
Time to call in the YouTube bots to hit those like buttons, huh?
Yeah.
Fauci and Biden. Biden always gets ratioed as well. From Raphael, Alex C. So impressed. A young blood like you knows who Samuel Doe was. Outstanding. So proud of you. Nice. Thank you. you're the one that talked mostly about Samuel Doe, though, Alexander. But thank
Well,
you.
but it's true. I mean, but both of us, we work together and we both bring our contributions, and we both know huge amounts. I mean, Alex, I should say, has come from a diplomatic family, so he is certainly somebody who's very well informed about world things. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Raphael. From Heyman699, can an empire be sustained by middle-manning the global economy at gunpoint and propaganda?
No, you can't do it. I mean, I think it was some great man, I can't forget which, he said, bayonets are great things. You can do all kinds of things with them except sit on them. And that's true of every system that is based ultimately on coercion and force. They are always brittle. There has to be consent. And if the consent isn't there, and if, by the way, it's built on lies and deception too, if you try and combine force with lies, well, you could prolong it a little longer, but in the end, again, it will unravel. So the answer is no. But the damage that can be done along the way can be enormous.
Yeah. From Amrit, Russians probably use photonic radar in their air defense and fighter jets, as its development was told by TASS in 2018. These are more advanced. These were invented in Italy by CNIT, PISA. 2013.
But first of all, I should quickly declare that I'm not a technological or technical person, something I often have to point out in videos. I'm not able to discuss the intricacies and advantages of photonic radar, except to say that it is apparently the next stage in radar development, especially for aircraft and anti-aircraft missile systems, and that apparently once it is brought into operation, it will be a very effective counter to stealth aircraft, or at least that's what's claimed. The Russians do not have photonic radar in their aircraft at the moment. It is still in the development phase. That I think is often discussed and commented upon in the Russian media. They definitely do have programs to develop photonic radar, but it's not yet in service with their Air Force or their air defense system. And I'm sure that they're not the only people who are working on photonic radar. I'm sure the United States is too, and China must be also.
Yeah. Nikos says, seems like Greece is going for elections. Kalispera, pedia. The problem is not the elections, it's who takes over for Mitsotakis. Not that Mitsotakis is doing a bang-up job. He's not, but who takes over?
Well, I mean, the opposition is presumably Tsipras and Syriza, which is, it is for us. I mean, it's very much cry the beloved country. I mean, we look at the situation in Greece, and you want to tear out your hair. You say to yourself, who is there who can lead the country out of the mess it's in? And there isn't anyone. There isn't anyone at all. I mean, if you go to every cafe in Athens, you will find people who will talk about things that could be done. You will find more sense talking to people in cafes than you will in the parliament. But if you're talking about political leaders, we just don't have any.
From Sean Wookie, chance the U.S. and China are play fighting while doing damage to the U.S. from within, have recently proclaimed to have infiltrated at all levels.
You've made a very, very incisive point, because I think this is one of the great differences between China and the US. China, whatever else you think about it, is a purposeful, united, joined up government. It has its objectives. You might find it a troubling, sinister place. I know a lot of people think like that, but they have a plan. They have a project, and they're united about carrying it through. The United States is not like that. It's not united in its policies. And you're quite right. There is a policy of confrontation towards China, which is the one that you read about in the media, that the State Department talks about in its press releases, that the president talks about when he makes his speeches. And then there is the reality of what is going on the ground. And you're quite right. The Chinese are very heavily involved in many aspects now of US life. They are heavily involved in many aspects of the American, the US economy. And perhaps the most telling thing of all has been the fact that the trade surplus, the Chinese trade surplus with the United States, has actually been growing. So a lot of talk from the administration up to now, but the reality is very little action. And not only that, one gets the sense, I don't think it's the sense, I think it is the fact that at every level in the US government and in the administration and in the Democratic Party and in the business community which supports these things, you find people who are not only opposed to these policies, but who want to subvert them because they are personally invested in keeping things good with China. They may be invested for all sorts of reasons. They may be invested because, well, as some of them have done, they sleep with Chinese spies. They may be invested because ideologically they're very close to the Chinese, or they may be invested because they make lots and lots and lots of money out of their dealings with China. But that's the truth.
And he's on the House Intelligence Committee, Swalwell. And he's on the House Intelligence Committee.
I know.
So forget about their words, just look at their actions. You're right. I think it's fair to say that the U.S. is captured by China on many levels, not only in the government, but also in business and in society. Hollywood, the NBA. I mean, it's universities. Absolutely. They are captured by China. And it's not an overnight thing. This has been brewing for the past 20 years. I mean,
absolutely. The Chinese, as I said, they set out to do something, and they do it methodically and systematically, and they're prepared to do it over a very long time. And the United States opened its doors, let it happen. And lots. Absolutely. That was in the United States, the Clinton period. That was when it. And at the same time, lots of people have, in their own kinds of ways, now benefited from it and have become so enmeshed in it that they are a very, very powerful interest groups. Very powerful interest groups in Wall Street, in Hollywood, in the business community, in industrial groups, in the White House, in the State Department, in Congress, in the tech companies. They're all now very happy to keep this thing going as it has. It's completely different from what happened, say, in the 1940s, where at the start of the First Cold War. At that time, the Soviet Union and the United States were each united behind their policies. This time, the United States is not.
Yeah. The Takuza says, do you think that global hacking ransomware phenomenon is a signal of balkanization of world internet? So all of those dollars cannot be imported back to the US and effectively bankrupting China?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I mean, I think the balkanization of the internet is happening anyway. I mean, because of the way in which the internet has been used in the United States for political purposes too. I think we're going to move forward into a completely different internet world. I stress again, I'm not a technical man, but we're now going to start seeing things develop with blockchain, which are going to change everything radically. And I'm not sure how that will work out. I doubt that it will bankrupt China. I doubt that it will bankrupt America, actually. But I think that the breakdown of the internet and that kind of world is now certainty. Alex?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. The blockchain is going to change everything, but Takuza comes up with a follow-up. And actually, I'm curious about this this answer as well. He says, China's biggest problem is if the dollar collapsed or U.S. defaulted on its debt. I always wonder about that because we said that China is completely invested in the U.S. And there are many people that have been captured by China. But yeah, China does have a lot of U.S. debt. What happens in that case if there is some sort of event which causes the USD to collapse or a default or something along those lines? What happens to China? Does China also collapse?
It doesn't collapse, but it's very badly hit. But of course, it's not just China that'll be badly hit. I mean, to be very clear, the whole world will be very badly hit. I mean, people who talk about, imploding the dollar, bankrupting the US, all that sort of thing, need to understand that this would be an enormous event with titanic consequences. So it would be very bad for China because it would lose its major trade partner overnight. It would lose all that money that it has in terms of bonds. Of American treasuries. It would lose all of that money. It would be very, very, very severely hit indeed. It can probably ride it out, but it would face a severe recession, and that might put great strains on its political system. And if you remember, when we were talking at our previous live, our last live, I said that there is a difference, and about the stability, the sense of internal stability of the Chinese political system. So that I think would be a major challenge for China. It could probably overcome it, but it would be enormous problems for China. Other countries would be hit even worse. And if you're talking about, say, the oil producers, I mean, it's just unimaginable what would happen to them if that world were to collapse suddenly in that kind of way.
Okay, let's stick to China for a little bit, and then we'll move to Haiti. Some questions on Haiti. SERP YouTube wants to know, what role does the Quad alliance play in the US-China smash-up? If something pops off, who else gets dragged in by the attached alliances? Canada, etc.?
Well, very good question. Of course, the US is trying to involve the European countries as well. Now, there are two countries that really matter in the Quad in terms of their military power. One is Japan, which has an extensive navy and air force, and the other is India, which is, of course, on the other side of China. Now, it's important to say that the Quad at the moment is not an alliance, but Japan has increasingly been saying that if there is a Chinese attack on Taiwan, then Japan might come to the rescue of Taiwan alongside the United States. And that would certainly change the military balance at the moment. Though it's important to say that the Chinese naval buildup is so rapid that it's likely that the balance would shift back to China very quickly. So Japan is an important factor. India is a huge country. It's got very powerful or potentially very powerful armed forces. It could create many problems for China in its western borders, which are not clearly delineated and where there are regular clashes between Chinese and Indian troops. So India and Japan are problems that China has. And it's probably fair to say, that it's undoubtedly true to say, that China hasn't handled its relationship with either of these countries well. I mean, it's managed to spoil its relations with Japan, which, believe it or not, in the 80s were very close, and it's never sorted out a good and stable relationship with India. But in the event that there is a big conflict between the United States and China, do Japan and India join in? And I think the answer is we simply don't know. I think Japan might do if it felt really, that Taiwan was threatened and that this was a big threat for Japan itself. But of course, it'd be a very, very dangerous and risky thing for Japan to do. Would India want to become involved? Here, I have to say, I am much less sure, because it seems to me that India is a huge country. It's one that really does want at some point to be thought of as a great power on its own account. And I'm not convinced that the Indians, in that kind of situation, would necessarily want to go to war with China on behalf of the United States. So, I think we've got to wait and see. But for the moment, I think the Quad is something people talk about more than something that actually has an actual reality in that respect. The Japanese-US alliance, that's very strong. That's existed for a very long time. The US-Indian relationship is a lot less than an alliance at the moment. And the Quad technically isn't an alliance at all.
Okay. From Sparky, my guess is Moise was to be escorted by US government associates out of Haiti to live in exile, as was done with Aristide, but it went terribly wrong. That's an interesting.
That is a very, very interesting theory. That is, I wonder whether you might not have hit the nail on the head, actually. I mean, that seems by far the most plausible explanation of this mess.
All right. From where are we here? From Rifi, that's Tarif, 499. Interview Jemima Pierre, PhD, UCLA, James Horn, PhD, University of Houston, on Haiti and African geopolitics. SOS stock to the moon. It's under $3 a share.
Well, I think.
Well, the suggestion to interview people
I think so. Well, I think so.
Haiti
Yeah,
and
I
African
think
geopolitics.
I think so. I think it's a very good idea, actually.
Thank you, Rifi, for that. Where are we here? The English loyalist question says the U.S. does collapse or something. How long before China and Russia are at each other's throats?
Well, this is a question that comes brought up many times. I think the short answer is we simply don't know. I know that there is this view, which has become very widespread, many people in the West, that the Chinese and the Russians are basically very wary and suspicious of each other, and that all the talk of friendship and alliance is really entirely one of convenience, and that they're really the best of frenemies. I have to say, I'm becoming increasingly skeptical about that. But if there is no United States, then of course they will have different reasons to go their separate ways, and perhaps they will. I mean, it's a world without the United States as a dominant power is so different from the world we live in today that it's an almost unimaginable one. I suppose the correct answer to your question is that we can only wait and see if such a thing were to happen. It's far from sure that it would. And for the moment, the Russians and the Chinese are working together very closely. And that is the reality that the United States and everybody around the world must work with.
Yeah, Sparky says, some in Haiti say Moise was about to prosecute 2 Clinton associates who own Haitian utilities, so Moise had to be removed sooner rather than later.
How very interesting.
Those Clintons, yeah.
How very
what they've done to Haiti.
Well, I mean, to be straightforward about it, I sometimes get the impression that Haiti is basically, regarded by the Clintons almost as their personal property.
Yeah, I think I think you're right on that. From Hunger, first it was the neocon DOD war on terror. Then it was the neoliberal State Department sponsored Arab Spring, both monumental failures. What will the USG come up with next for the region? I shudder to think.
No, I completely agree. I mean, as I said, it is interesting that, as I said, Tunisia, which, as I said, was the start of the Arab Spring. Nobody I noticed is saying this, but the start of the Arab Spring was Tunisia. And I remember reading article after article by all sorts of people connected with the various Western NGOs. In other words, with the Western regime change community, the democracy promotion community, telling us about, things may not have worked out well in Libya. They may not have worked out so well in Syria or in Iraq, but Tunisia is the proof that what we do can work. And, well, we've seen that isn't so. What they will come up with next, I have no idea. But one thing I'm absolutely sure, they will come up with something.
Yeah, they will come up with something. From Rafael says, I strongly believe a decision has been reached among NATO and EU behind the scenes that the next world war will be fought over the USA. Well, that's interesting.
My goodness.
Will be fought over the USA.
Yeah.
Probably right.
Well, indeed. I should say something, I've read historians, I'm talking about academic historians, who say that the way to think of the world wars, the First and Second World Wars, is as the wars of the British succession. It had become clear increasingly to more and more people at the start of the 20th century that the British Empire was running its course. And so you saw a massive rush, including some people in Britain, to find mechanisms to replace it. And that this, in fact, led to war. And that, in fact, Britain was the central feature, the player in this war, and it was basically fought over Britain. And maybe that's what we're going to see again. Maybe we're going to see wars of American succession. I sincerely hope not. And I'm going to say something else. I think that at the moment, I don't believe it will happen, because I still believe that the United States remains very strong.
From Mark Hewitt, a British scientist has reportedly made great progress with nuclear fusion. Bezos may invest in this new form of energy. No word of investment from the UK government.
Well, possibly. I must say, I mean, again, I'm not a technological or technical person. I've been hearing stories about nuclear fusion all my adult life. Perhaps, and I hope this particular scientist has achieved a breakthrough. I certainly hope so. But, I'm not in a position, I can't really comment about it. And the government at the moment in Britain is in such a mess over science and scientific advice that I'm not surprised that they're steering clear of investing in scientific projects.
Yeah. Il Panda Cub says, weak U.S. at global stage exposes how the EU plays with both the U.S. and China. Trump overreached and Biden is underreaching.
That's not a bad way of putting it, actually. I think that there's something a little bit, I think in Biden's case, he's not just underreaching. As I said, he's keeping his hands behind his back because that's where he wants them, essentially. I mean, he's not really, I don't think he's playing a very active diplomatic game, actually. I think that the more I see of this administration, the less coherent, the more incoherent, and the less purposeful it really looks. Whereas Trump was actually purposeful. I mean, he was a man with ideas, and that's the fundamental point. That's a fundamental difference. Even the Financial Times, I noticed, is now starting to talk and discuss and mention this kind of thing. And they are perhaps, apart from The Guardian, Biden's greatest, fans in the British media. So I think you're onto something there, but I think that it isn't just that Biden is underreaching; he is purposefully underreaching. Anyway, we will see.
He may not even know that he's underreaching.
Well, exactly. I mean,
after the town hall performance.
When we talk about Biden, I think it's indeed the town hall performance. When we talk about Biden, I think it's always important to say that we're attaching a name to a system, if you like. It's not. I mean, there's Biden the person, and there's Biden the
machinery
machine, exactly. Yeah. Which they're not the same.
Yeah. Rifi says, I have Gemina's contact info. I can contact her for you all. Yes,
absolutely.
Definitely do that. We appreciate that. From Sean, the left has been preaching anti-Russia until recently, while we see CCP, the real foe, for a year. Result from proving fraud goes which way?
Absolutely true. That's completely right. I mean, this is the thing that's baffled me for years, actually. I mean, the United States, well, not the United States, I mean, people in the West, the left, as you correctly say, people like that, have been talking on and on and on and on about Russia, where Russia is no conceivable adversary or rival to the US in the way that the Soviet Union once was. And they've been ignoring this gigantic colossus in the East that's been rising. And it's been a strange, bizarre blindness. Well, of course, there's explanations for it. We talked about some people being invested in the rise of that colossus, not perhaps being particularly bothered about it. Perhaps in the case of some people, they wanted to keep the focus in Russia in order to keep the focus away from the rise of the colossus, because they were invested in the rise of the colossus and they didn't want people to be worried about it too soon. So there may be that element in it too. And there may be also willful blindness on some part of some people. And the fact that some people left over from the Cold War continue to, feel that the real enemy is Russia because, well, it always has been. So it must continue to be for the indefinite future. And no doubt there are also some neocons with their great Brzezinski scheme of breaking up Russia into its component parts and occupying Eurasia and surrounding China and all the rest. But regardless, whatever the explanation, the fact is, if I was an American, I would be extremely worried and angry with my leaders for leading me into this position, because China didn't come out of nowhere. It's been, as I said, building up for 2 or 3 decades. And throughout that time, the United States has been obsessed with Russia, which was no threat to it.
Yeah, from Heyman says the U.S. are doing their best to renegotiate a better deal for themselves, BRI, while sacrificing their allies' future. Being America's enemy is bad. Being America's ally is fatal. That's a quote from Henry Kissinger.
Well, indeed, it's true in many ways. And we'll see what happens. By the way, the point about, being very careful about trusting the US is one which is widely discussed and spoken about around the world. And I spoke about India and its misgivings and the doubts many people in India might have about the merits of getting drawn into a war alongside the United States against China. And you do hear people in India talk about this. They say, that the US would never come to India's rescue. So why should we come to their rescue?
From Il Panda Cub says the MSM has actually, in my opinion, adjusted big a little bit. They are blaming his administration left and right, but not him as president.
That's right. That's completely right. At the moment, he's still beyond criticism. He's still somebody who we talk and praise. He's the great leader who, the Messiah figure that we've always hankered for. You're absolutely right. But criticisms are increasing, and they have to, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to conceal from people the realities of what is happening. My own personal view, and I think Alex said this a couple of days ago, the wheels are coming off, and they're coming off at multiple levels. They're going wrong in their foreign policy. The foreign policy isn't coordinated. The economic policy is utopian and fantastical, and the lots of other things aren't working out well either. So it's all coming unstuck. And it's beginning to look as if Congress is not going to be quite the pushover that people expected.
Little Panda Cub says Biden is reasonable at some points too. Why sanction Nord Stream 2 when it's 95% complete? Then he said something about giving weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah, no, well, this is it. I mean, these are the inconsistencies and the absurdities of it. And I mean, we've talked about Nord Stream 2 at huge length on our programs. I mean, I'm very tired of the subject, to be straightforward about this. I repeat again what I'm going to say. I mean, I think it is very bad news for Ukraine, which has brought it on itself, because of the extraordinary policies it has followed, including energy policies it has followed for a very, very long time. I don't think it has the enormous geostrategic significance that people otherwise say. I don't think it's going to mean the end of the Western alliance when it's built. I think some of the language people use about it is hyperbole. And I think that the US was very unwise, given the extent to which the Germans were committed to it, to set out to try and wreck it. And I think trying to do that, all it has done is expose the limits of US power. So at least in Europe. And I think that was a mistake at multiple levels. I think they need to push beyond Nord Stream 2, put it aside, and start working on more sensible things, and let countries trade with each other as they always do and always have done, and not assume that this is something that can be dictated for them by the United States.
Yeah. Little Panda Cub says, question, today's world leaders are more outspoken. Has it always been like that? Or is it social media or weaker US at, I just lost it, or weaker US at something? Little Panda Cub, weaker US at the global stage.
Well, can I say, first of all, he's not typical of how foreign policy about statements used to be conducted. I mean, you remember Theodore Roosevelt? The United States talks soft and carries a big stick. I mean, that was much more the style of just diplomacy. I mean, can I just give an example? In the 19th century, a telegram, there was a telegram that was sent by Bismarck, who wanted to provoke a war with France from a resort, a resort in Ems. And it was extremely, if you read it today, you wouldn't possibly see what on earth it was all about. It was all about the fact that the King of Prussia didn't want to meet the French ambassador. And it was seen as so outrageous, this telegram, that it provoked a war. People took these things very seriously, and they minded their language extremely carefully, and they were extremely careful how they spoke and what they said. And today, outrageous things get said. I mean, people talk in the most ludicrous and appalling ways, and there's been a general collapse in language and manners that has been astonishing. And, you know, we can blame social media to some extent for this, but it seems to me that the political leadership in the democracies in the Western countries have played an absolutely key role in this, because they all talk either in this extraordinary distorted language, which is frustrating and aggravating for many people, or they are extremely abusive in the way they talk themselves, and they've encouraged the media to be.
Yeah, world leaders have just they've just gotten stupid.
Absolutely,
it's that simple. They're stupid, they're corrupt, they're bought off.
Absolutely,
it's not a good mix.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, I think somebody once said, you know, all this talk about frank speech, which is the way it's always, you know, justified, just an excuse mostly for bad manners. I mean, you can say things, you can be very firm, but you don't have to be abusive. And of course, leaders today think they are being clever when they are.
Raphael says, why the Western media is not talking about the fact that the USA no longer has strike first ability. Russia can shoot down anything within minutes now.
Well, let's be careful. I'm sure they can't shoot down everything that the Americans throw at them. But it's true. There has been a major change in the strategic balance over the last couple of years. The Russians have upgraded their strategic balance to an extraordinary degree, to an extent that the United States had not expected. And we spoke earlier when we talked about Ukraine, about the fact that the Russians have become much more self-confident and therefore more assertive. It is partly because they feel that they have now achieved again that military strategic equality, at least at the nuclear level, that they had during the Cold War. And that has changed the political atmosphere and the political climate. And it's something which many people in the United States don't know, and which the media never discusses, and which the political class, of course, won't openly admit to. So it's something that people need to start getting used to, and perhaps at some point they will.
Okay, from Little Panda Cub says, I thought foreign policy was either with bombs or backroom strong arming. UN Security Council.
Well, foreign policy is a complex mixture of things. It's a lot of diplomacy. It's obviously force is an important part of diplomacy. Any country that doesn't have powerful armed forces is going to find itself at a disadvantage. It's about using your assets, it's your economic assets, your political assets. It's about many things. Above all, it's about having a strategy. It's about having an idea of what you want to do. It's about having a plan. And, you know, it might not be a very detailed plan, but you must have an overall conception, both of what your interests are and how you're going to pursue those interests. And then you use all these various elements together in order to promote those interests and to pursue that plan. Where is the plan? What plan does the United States have now? None.
All right, let's go to the chat here, to the live stream chat, and see if there's any questions. Alexander, we knocked out most of the super chats. Little Panda has a super chat which says, what's your backgrounds?
Right. Well, as I said, I come from a political family in Greece, going all the way back to the 19th century. I've had parents who were, in politics. I became involved through no choice of wish of my own in a political crisis in Greece in the late 1960s, which forced me to come to Britain. I became educated here. I practiced in the law here for many years. And then gradually, through various things, I became what I am now. Over to Alex.
I'm not going to give my background. I'm sorry. Sorry, Little Panda Cup. I mean, you guys know my background. You see me walking the streets all over the place now.
I'm sure enough.
So, yeah. All right. GEC is in the house. Good to have you here, GEC. Great to see you moderating and helping us moderate this this live stream. Over the next 10 years, would you rather be in Europe, the USA, or South America, Argentina? I'm wondering if I should get out of the USA now. This is from Echteben.
You know, I would once upon a time have found it inconceivable that I would not want to be in a place like New York, for example, which I thought was an absolutely amazing city. And I would never even dream of giving that kind of advice then. And I'm probably not going to give it now. I've never been to Argentina, for one thing. People tell me Buenos Aires is a wonderful city, but Argentina is a country which is regularly racked by crises and political problems and inflation. And I hope they will sort it out. And I'm sure it's a wonderful country, but I still think that perhaps life in the United States is more secure and better than it is there. And once upon a time, I would have also said that perhaps Europe is a wonderful place to go and live in and to bring up your family. And it is no longer that anymore. So if you ask me to say to you, which place would I go to, which, you know, if I wanted to find an ideal place, I would struggle today, actually. I wouldn't know. I mean, lots of problems in the United States, lots of problems in Europe. I, on balance, still think you're probably better off staying where you are.
Eastern Europe, some places in Asia, perhaps.
Yeah, more indeed. Yeah, Singapore.
Singapore. There's a lot of places in Eastern Europe, though, too, that I think have a good quality of life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Moscow, which we both know.
And, Moscow's a great city. St. Petersburg's a really nice city. There are a lot of people that are happy in Ukraine. I know a lot of people that are happy living in Kiev and Kharkiv and Slovakia, Hungary, Poland. I hear a lot of good things about Poland.
Absolutely, I've heard that too.
Serbia, I've heard a lot of good things living there. There's a lot of places to discover. So I would kind of say I would lean towards Eastern Europe.
Right.
That would be where I would lean towards.
Right.
Yeah, it's just my own preference. But there's Asia as well. So anyway, Little Panda Cub says, has life changed since YouTube? How much hate? We get our fair share of hate. Yeah,
we certainly do.
Yeah. Has it changed with YouTube? I think YouTube's changed.
Yeah,
and we've had to dance around a lot of news topics and news issues. And I'm trying to get a video up, Alexander, on the protests, and I put it up, and I already got dinged for it.
Oh wow, well, there you go.
It wasn't against the account. That was just a normal ding. So now I'm gonna, to everyone that's watching, I'm gonna put that video on Locals and ODYSEE, Super U, BitChute.
Yeah.
So YouTube has changed a lot, and it's made it very, very hard for us to deliver a lot of news stories that we would like to talk about.
Absolutely.
For example, what's going on in Arizona and in the U.S. The U.S. has become very hard to cover.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, when I started my own channel, if you go back and look at the early programs I used to do, they were focused very heavily on the US. I don't dare touch it now, because I find that if I do, I get so much trouble from the platform that I prefer to do it in other forms and in other places increasingly. So it's very, very difficult. Of course, my channel is a supplement to this channel, and on this channel we talk about US news much more. But it's become much harder than it was. And it's really very exasperating because, of course, the US is still very much the center of certainly my interests.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about the US, but
absolutely. I mean, it's
very tiring, and it's tiring too. To constly filter your own words, you lose your train of thought.
Exactly. It's an exhausting thing. It's exhausting. But as I said, we are starting to develop other platforms, and please do keep an eye on what we're doing there. I mean, we're both very overworked people, Alex especially, but we've got plans. And things are going to start evolving before very long. And on these other platforms, we are freer to speak than we are here.
Yeah. Echteben says, sorry, I know it's an unanswerable question. Argentina is culturally great, but an economic disaster. Thanks for the insight. Love your channel. Poland is an option.
Yeah. Poland is an option. I would agree
many
with that.
options in this world. It's a big world.
Absolutely.
There are many
Yes.
places to go.
Yes. Yes.
From Sentinel, given the scale of the protests against the shot passports, do you think governments will start to back down, or will they push to the point where things start to degenerate into violence?
The consistent pattern of the last couple of years is that when governments face challenges of this kind, they don't pull back, they double down. And I think that is exactly what we're going to see. Whether it will end in violence, I hope not, is the answer. But it would not be surprise me if we did.
Do you think that the globalists, the elites, they have no problem with the protests? They actually kind of welcome the protests because the protests will give them cause to censor more, to surveil more, to crack down more. So either way they win. And we have to, and people have to, I mean, it's their right to protest.
Absolutely.
First and foremost. But if they feel they need to protest, then they have a right to protest. Yeah. And if they don't protest, then, the government's just going to pass these QR codes, these surveillance, these mandatory things, they're just going to rubber stamp them through. So yes, you need to protest. But the globalists are also sitting there saying, that's fine. We were expecting protests. Go ahead and protest because that'll give us more cause to surveil and crack down. There was an Australian official, Alexander, before you answer, who did come out and say after the Sydney protests, and he really did say this, and I quote, he says, we're going to create a strike force to go after those people at the protest, a strike force.
I don't think there's any doubt about this at all. Of course, there are people who think like this. And by the way, it's a time and tested thing. You provoke protests, and then you use the fact of the protests in order to intensify your already existing repressive agenda. So this isn't new. It's called in some countries provocation tactics. But this is exactly what I think we're seeing in many places. You mentioned Australia. We saw it in the United States very recently. I think you know what I'm alluding to, and how a certain event which happened at the start of this year has been used there. So of course, that goes on. And of course, there are some people who think that. But of course, it's always got the potential to get out of control. Way back in Russia, I can always go back to Russia because it provides, in many ways, the revolutionary template. There were people in Russia who deliberately manufactured protests in that way, either in order to incite repressions that they thought they could benefit from, or in order to gain political leverage over the governing power. And they did that on a very big scale. There's a particular official called Zubarev from that period of time who is particularly associated with this kind of thing. And for example, the famous protest that took place in January 1905, which ended in the massacre that is called Bloody Sunday, that was to some extent a staged, orchestrated protest of that sort. But what actually happened is that eventually that whole procedure of creating protests and a kind of atmosphere where protests happened and where people felt obliged to go into protests spiraled out of control. And the people who eventually surfed the wave were not the people who'd actually created the wave in the first place. And that's always the risk these people run. But the fact remains, I have no doubt about it at all, that provocation tactics, the attempt to stir up protests, to allow protests to happen, to use the fact of protests to justify further clampdowns, I've no doubt about it. It is definitely there.
All right. Little Panda Cub says, thank you for putting yourselves out there, learning tons. Thank you very much for that super chat, Little Panda. And we have another super chat from Boris who says, the world is effed up. Nowhere to go, nowhere to run. Yeah. So, sometimes you don't need to run. Sometimes
to stand firm and fight firm, back.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for that super chat. And Rich says, Italy in the south, Germany in the north, lead two regions in the European Union. Well, Italy, Germany.
Yeah, it's an interesting Italy, Germany, France. That's the triangle of the European Union. South of Italy, very interesting. North of Germany, very interesting too. We'll see.
Yeah. From Radovid says, Slovenia is a cool place, best from the west and east. Almost no news coming from there, and no news usually means good news. I've heard very nice things about
it. It is a beautiful place. I mean, I've been to Slovenia. I mean, Ljubljana, the capital, is a beautiful place. It's got wonderful alpine scenery, amazing skiing, if you like skiing. And I don't, by the way, I'm not good at it, my wife is. But you can go walking in the mountains and it's fantastic. It's a marvelous place, fine cuisine. It's a beautiful country and very cultured also. There was a rock group, some people might remember, Lieback, that came from there, for example.
Yes. Slovenia, guys, check it out.
Slovenia,
Guys, within 5 years, a coalition of China, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba is going to be dominant military power soon. This is coming from Raphael.
Well, I don't think all of those countries, I mean, I can't really imagine Venezuela, for example, or Cuba becoming military powers, but China and Russia are certainly rising military powers. And way back in 2018, there was a very interesting document, but published by the Pentagon, which actually spoke rather despondently about the return of great power competition. Of course, it meant military competition. And this was published by the Pentagon. And so that is something to really consider. And of course, the United States, which had become accustomed in the 90s and 2000s to thinking of itself as the great military power without any peer or challenger, has now found itself in a different situation, and it needs to adjust to that fact, and it needs to modify its diplomacy to take that into account.
Yeah. All right, Alexander, you want to go for like 5 more minutes?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's absolutely.
5 more minutes, and we'll wrap it up. I did get an email from someone in South Africa. I'm looking at the chat. And I got an email from someone in South Africa. I don't know if it's accurate, but they said that you now get 6 months in prison in South Africa if you talk about the medications and the mandatory measures and all this stuff on WhatsApp and text messaging.
I can't corroborate that. I don't know, but
I haven't corroborated it either. But
no.
I'm just throwing it out there.
It's very interesting. But can I just say,
scary if it's true?
Absolutely. But going back to that earlier question, if you're talking about provocation tactics and protests and violence being used as a pretext by some people to clamp down and tighten the grip even further, well, we saw lots of protests in South Africa, and I'm perfectly willing to believe, in fact, I think it's highly likely that part of that agenda is also there in South Africa too. So, let's be very realistic about the way the world works. This does happen.
To clamp down, South Africa's they're going to double down and clamp down on
everything. Absolutely. And the protests and the rioting may have actually been intended partly. It might have been allowed to happen in order that you can clamp down even more strongly afterwards.
Yeah, these guys live for chaos.
Yeah,
they want the chaos, they want the division, they want the protests up to a certain level.
Up to a certain level.
They don't want like a yellow vests where it goes week after week for like 3 months. Exactly. That irks them. Exactly. But I think Alexander protests, say like for 2, 3, 4 weeks, for things to get a little bit out of hand, for the police to come in, tear gas, all those optics. I think that's what they want.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. If you get a yellow vest scenario, then that starts to really to bother them.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I would add, by the way, and this has been my consistent view, and I speak with somebody, as I said, who is familiar with how governments think, that big, peaceful, well-organized protests are much more scary to governments than violent ones. Violent ones they know how to deal with. Big protests that bring out hundreds of thousands, millions of people, that might persuade people to lay down their labor, to do all kinds of things like that. That's the way to really rattle governments. Do it in a peaceful, orderly, law-abiding way on a big scale that they don't really have a response to.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let's go into this live stream. Take 1 or 2 more questions and we'll wrap it up. Let me go through and see what people are talking about and if there's any questions that someone wants to throw at us so we can wrap up this Monday live. Mm-hmm. 1 second, Alexander. Let's see. Yellow vest activists moving between cities really outwitted the gendarmes. Yes, they really did outwit them. They did crack the code, the yellow vests.
Absolutely. And of course, we see what happened there was because the government was trying to obviously, in a way, to provoke violence. People ultimately ended up by blaming the government for the violence. And that has damaged Macron's credibility in a way that he's never really recovered from. So there's a good example of a very clever, very skillful, but genuine grassroots popular protest that changed the political temperature and direction of France.
And no centralized person running it or centralized group.
Exactly.
So it was very hard for the French authorities to pin down who they're going to go after.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
GEC says they want us afraid to protest, so protests should double down, but they'll be targeted by power-hungry politicians, corrupt police, and smeared by lying media.
Oh, true. Absolutely. Of course. And that's one reason why people who undertake these things need to be very well aware of what they're facing and very disciplined about what they're doing.
Yeah. From Shifu, £5 super chat says, Sherman in China to threat military unless 1, CN buy debt like in 2018, 2, devalue yuan to help curb inflation in the USA, and 3, buy American products.
Yes, I did a program about Sherman's visit to the US, which is coming out on my channel shortly. I think that quite likely Sherman has come up with all kinds of ideas like that. It reminds me what you're suggesting of what the US happened with Japan in the 1980s, when there were negotiations between the US and Japan, and there was the so-called famous Plaza Accord, which was negotiated eventually in the Plaza Hotel in New York. And the purpose of that was to get the Japanese to basically increase the value of their currency in order to reduce their trade surplus with the United States. And many people in Japan, perhaps unfairly, attribute all the subsequent economic problems that Japan has suffered to the Plaza Accord. Well, I think we are already getting enough information about what's been going on in Tianjin in this meeting between Sherman and the Chinese officials. I should say Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, a close acolyte of Hillary Clinton's, by the way.
All the same people.
Absolutely. It's very interesting. I mean, you follow her career. I discussed it on my program, but she starts as a social worker. Somehow she finds some kind of contact with the Clintons. She gets brought into the State Department, basically in the 1990s when the Clintons are around. Then obviously she goes and works for Fannie Mae afterwards. And then when the Obama administration comes along and Hillary Clinton becomes Secretary of State, she brings Wendy Sherman back into the State Department and gives her an important role managing foreign policy towards Russia. It sounds extraordinary to say all of this. But anyway, so Wendy Sherman is absolutely part of the Clinton the larger Clinton family. But anyway, she's currently in Tianjin. She's talking with the Chinese, with Foreign Minister Wang Yi and others. And we're getting it looks like a very confrontational meeting at the moment, with the Chinese pushing back hard. And I don't know what Wendy Sherman at the moment is doing, but frankly, I don't know that she's really up to very much, actually.
This is where the U.S. is so weak. These aren't trained diplomats.
No. I made exactly that point on in this program that's coming out. You're absolutely right, Alex. That's exactly right. They don't have trained professional career diplomats running these sort of negotiations.
Yeah, and they get schooled and they get run over and every freaking time.
Exactly.
Is it that hard for the U.S. to just get trained professional diplomats in these positions?
No, it's not at all. And it's had outstanding diplomats in the past. I mean,
in the past.
In the past. But especially since the 1990s. Not really. I mean, today, it's, if you're a friend of Hillary Clinton, you get appointed deputy secretary of state. That's basically
Yeah,
how
and you
it
go
works.
off to China and Russia and talk about stuff that you have
You
no
don't-
idea what the hell's going on.
Exactly.
All right, we'll do a few more. Let's talk about Xi's speech with regards to Tibet. Did you hear about that?
Absolutely. He also visited Tibet too. I mean, he's very visible, and of course, it's China being increasingly assertive, Xi being increasingly assertive as China's leader, and of course, it's something that I think is creating a great deal of an unsettling effect, let me put it like this, around the world. But of course, China is in Tibet. It's never going to let go, at least not unless it's forced to. And Xi is basically there to remind everybody that that's the situation now. So it's Xi making quite sure that what happened in Xinjiang province isn't going to happen in Tibet either. And he goes there and he meets the officials and he meets the military people there and he makes these very tough speeches and he reminds everybody who's in charge. He reminds the outside world who's in charge in Tibet. He reminds the Dalai Lama who's actually in charge. And as I said, he's the first Chinese leader, I think, ever to visit Tibet.
Yeah. Transnistria. Any word about Transnistria? We don't really talk about that at all.
No, we don't at all. There's been an election in Moldova, which has led to the election of a pro-Western president, and then in a landslide, a pro-Western parliament. And there's been much discussion about where all this is going to lead to with Transnistria. The talk is that the US has actually urged this pro-Western government to actually talk to Russia and to see whether or not they can come to some kind of deal with the Russians over Transnistria. I don't see why the Russians would want to do a deal with over Transnistria. And bear in mind, and here I think Putin's article about Ukraine is directly relevant. From the Russian point of view, Transnistria is a Russian-speaking region and is part of the greater Russian world, then it's not some place that the Russians are going to give up to Moldova, so that Moldova, the current leadership in Moldova, can pursue its pro-Western, pro-EU aspirations. So I think actually it's probably a deadlocked issue. That's my sense anyway.
All right. And a super chat from Luis, which says, any opinions on the new president of Peru? Any indication that he may change Peru's political alignment from US to Russia and China?
Well, he might do. I mean, my own sense, actually, is that he's more like Alexis Tsipras in Greece than anything else. I mean, that's my own, that's my own sense. I mean, he might talk like that. I remember Tsipras did too. I mean, when he became prime minister, he was all going to be, we're going to improve relations with the Russians, not so keen on sanctions. And in fact, it turned out that all his real allegiances were with the left in the US. And I get the sense this guy in Peru is probably the same, actually. We've did a program about Peru. And, one of the things that really has surprised me is that the sort of political forces that have risen in South America over the last few months, which are identified very much with the left, seem to be talking the language of the US Democratic Party. I mean, they're raising issues of identity and whatever, which one doesn't really associate with South America. So I think that I think that much more likely we're going to see, if anything, the new Peru actually align even more strongly with the US, provided it continues to be led by the people who are in charge at the moment. I think they come out of the same stable. That's my own personal view.
Yeah. We'll leave it on that note. I think South America is taking a hard turn towards the left.
Absolutely, no question.
It's woke. South America is becoming woke.
It's believable to think that, isn't it? Yeah, the land that gave us the word machismo. I mean, it's quite.
That's not a good sign.
I mean, anyway. I mean, it's an interesting world that
but
we live
it
in.
is moving. On a serious note, it is moving left.
Oh, you absolutely, no question. I mean, everywhere, country after country is doing so. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, guys, we'll end it there. Anything else you want to add, Alexander?
No. I mean, we've covered a very great range, but I mean, gosh, I mean, we are in a world in turmoil. I mean, look, we talk about Haiti, we talk about Peru, we talk about South Africa, we talk about Tunisia, all these places. I mean, or lots of things going on in the world. It's difficult to keep up with them all, and the center is the United States. That's really where the real things, the real epicenter of crisis is, in some ways, in my opinion at least, and where the real conflict of ideas is happening. It's happening in the US, and that's partly why they're so key that we don't talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. That's why they don't want us to talk about it, because that's where you could fix a lot of what's going on.
Absolutely.
If you could have discussion and talk about all the things that are happening. But
absolutely,
they won't allow that. Hey Man came in with a $6.99 super chat. In the table full of aces, Russia is the 10 that is needed to form a blackjack.
There's a very famous quote of Putin's. It was made in private to, guess, Joe Biden. Joe Biden went to Putin, and this is in 2011, I think, when Putin was thinking of running for the presidency. He'd been prime minister for a time, and Biden was sent by Obama, and Obama told Biden to tell Putin, don't run for the presidency. And Putin said, mind your own business. And then Biden told Putin that, Russia can't lead the world. And Putin fired back, no, Russia cannot lead the world, but it can decide who will.
Yeah. There was someone actually, Tekuzu said, Russia is a kingmaker.
Yeah.
As you were saying that, we put that in there.
Absolutely, we know that because there was one of the officials who was there, a man called Shuvalov, disclosed this exchange, and in fact, the Russians have confirmed that it actually happened. So that's what Putin and Biden really say to each other, not nonsense about, I look into your eyes and I don't see a soul, or any of that nonsense.
Stupidity, yeah.
Stupidity. Yeah.
Maybe Biden believes that. I mean, maybe now he believes that. Who knows?
Maybe he does. Maybe he does. Yeah. Perfectly true.
All right, we'll leave it there. GEC, thank you for moderating. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone with your questions, with your super chats, with your likes. Hit that like, and make sure you're still subscribed to this channel. Make sure you click that bell to get notifications. Look for Alexander's videos. Look for my videos. Look for the Duran's videos on SuperU and ODYSEE and BitChute and Rumble. And of course, go to our locals, guys. Go to our locals page. The link is in the comments down below and in the description box down below, and join us on locals. We are free to say whatever we want there. It is our own censor-proof community. So Join us there.
Absolutely.
All right, Alexander, have a good Monday, and we'll be back with many, many more videos tomorrow and for the whole week. Probably many more lives. We'll see. We'll see.
Absolutely.
How we take things.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Right.